All right, I want to take a look at the 2019 Microeconomics exam, FRQ number 1. So let me try and share my screen. All right, so here we are. First question. This is the long FRQ, but actually looking at this question, it is fairly short. There's an involved graph here, and you do need to know quite a bit for this question. But all said, I think this question is pretty manageable and fairly short. So let's see. Let's see. I can annotate this. Okay, so first thing we're gonna have to do, let's just read through the question here. As the only gas station in a small town, okay, let's underline that. Philip has a local monopoly on the sale of gasoline. Philip is currently earning positive economic profit. So they really kind of give you the key terms you need to know there. As we get into part A, they're going to ask you to draw a correctly labeled graph. And if you just read the question carefully, right, it tells you, or should realize, oh, I need to draw a monopoly graph, right? That was one of our types of market structures here. So let's carefully read through this. Again, as with all graphs, you need to draw them very carefully and correctly. And make sure you label everything. So again, they kind of give you a checklist here of things you got to include and how they want them labeled, so make sure you're consistent with what they want there. And that's part 1 and 2, right? Just essentially drawing the graph correctly. And then they're going to ask a question about deadweight loss. It's part 3. And then ask about if this monopoly were earning 0 economic profit, what quantity would they use? So those are a couple extra things we've got to have on our graph. Let's see, can I get? Scroll down, I have a little bit of more blank space here. Oops. All right, we'll do it down here. Okay, so we're going to start with the first part A, where we essentially need to draw this whole graph. So I'm going to do it right here where we can have space here. All right, so remember back to micro, right? Most of our micrographs are going to be very similar. Let me change this. This is I don't like that either. That's too. Let's go back to that. Okay, so we're going to label price up here, quantity down here. All right, so think about the different types of market structures, and this one's going to be, right, we know already we're looking for monopoly, right? So what does the monopoly market graph look like? So hopefully you remember you have these two sort of chopsticks, I think I sometimes call them. You know, over here is the demand curve, and right here is going to be the marginal revenue curve. So that's how you start with a monopoly graph. There are a couple other curves you need on here. Your average total cost curve and a marginal cost curve, right? So all firms, whether or not they're monopolists or not, have cost curves. So we know that. So our ATC curve should be something like this, U-shaped. And then if you remember a marginal cost curve is increasing. And it always hits or crosses through the minimum point of the average total cost curve, right? So if you're drawing this now, it should be something like that, marginal cost curve. And you see there that it's going to hit at approximately the minimum point. That makes sense, right? If the average total cost is changing as the marginal cost changes, if the marginal cost is below the average total cost, it's decreasing the average total cost as we increase. and then they cross, and then all of a sudden you have a marginal cost greater than the average total cost, so then it's going to start to pull that curve, that average up, right? So hence the sort of U shape of the average total cost, and then that's the reason the marginal cost is going to go through that minimum point. Okay, so now we got to label a couple of things on here that they wanted on our graph, and try to make sure you're consistent with what they wanted. So what do we know about profit maximization, really of any firm, and not just a monopoly, but this is your sort of golden rule of microeconomics, right? Profit maximization occurs where MR equals MC. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's where a firm should produce. That's how you determine the quantity. So how do we do that? Well, our marginal revenue curve is here, marginal cost, so that intersection is right here. So we're going to pull that point down, and they want us to label that our quantity, right? Q sub F. I think F stands for the fill up, the company, the gas station that we're talking about here, Q sub F. So that's the quantity they're going to produce at. And now the trick with monopolies, right? To determine the price, you get to come all the way up to the demand curve, right? People are at that quantity, the market demand is way up here. So people are willing to pay a price much higher up here. So, and they want us to label that, again, P sub F. That's the price for the fill up, and they're the only sort of gas station in town. All right, so that's our sort of basic monopolistic graph. You should have all those, be able to draw all those curves comfortably, and be sure to find those, you know, the profit maximizing quantity and where that price. And remember, you got to pull all the way up to the demand curve to find the price of a monopolist, right? So they have you know, monopolistic profits. That's the sort of the whole point of this. They don't ask about it in this question particularly, but if you were asked about economic profit, right, you would find this point here where it intersects with the average total cost curve and pull that across, right? That would be the rectangle representing the profit of this fill-up firm. They don't ask about that in this question, but it's always good to know if something like that would come up. All right, what they do ask about, and this is sort of the next thing they want you to do, is to shade the deadweight loss, right? So deadweight loss is a tricky concept. When we're thinking about monopolists, right? From a societal perspective, consumers are going to be best off, and this is true in other markets where there's more competition. Society is going to be better off when the quantity produced is going to be produced where the price is equal to the marginal cost. Okay, so you think about that, that's true in the perfectly competitive markets, right? The price ends up being the same as the marginal cost, and hence firms are not making economic profits, right? So it's sort of best off for, especially for consumers, from a consumer's perspective, for firms to produce where price is equal to marginal cost. So if we were thinking about that, we would look over here, right? Where would that be on this graph, right? So it would be the demand curve, where that intersects the marginal cost curve. And if that were the case, right, at that quantity, we'd be producing at a price equal to the marginal cost for our monopolist. Now, we're not at that point, right? So that quantity would be here. We're producing at a quantity over here and a price much higher. So think about a deadweight loss as being bound by these 3 points here. And it's not quite a triangle, right? Because we have a curve here, but they don't ask you to calculate anything. So all you got to do is shade. And let's do that now. The deadweight loss area, which is represented between all these lines here, these 3 points. All right, that's about as good as I can shade all the way up to this point, or this line. So you see, society, consumers for sure would be much better off if, fill up produced at a quantity that was higher and a price that was lower, right? So that's why that area in there becomes the deadweight loss to society. All right, and then the last part of this graph, they ask you to label another point, Q sub Z, and they want to label the point where this fill-up firm, has zero economic profits. All right, so again, we would need, when you calculate profit, right, you take your quantity that the firm is producing at, and then so let's just draw the initial profit. We don't need to put this in this question, but again, so the initial profit box, let's go like this, is represented right here. So this question in part 4 is asking to denote the quantity at which this firm is making zero economic profits, right? So we're moving a quantity out. We know, as quantity increases, this profit box is going to get smaller and smaller, right? Now, when you calculate profit, the key thing to see is where the average total cost curve is, because you're comparing, the quantity times the price. That's your revenue, and then you got to subtract the quantity times the average total cost. So what ends up happening here is you're going to look for the point where average total cost curve intersects your demand curve, right? So let's pull that point down. My MR is in the way. We're going to denote this Q sub Z. But look, now if we were calculating profit here, because this is the quantity, if it were producing at this quantity, to get the price, we would come up to the demand curve, right? So that would come across, let's just call this here P sub Z, because that would be the price at that quantity. And then, so quantity times QZ times PZ, right, is going to be your revenue in this case. And to subtract your cost, you're going to go to the average total cost curve, which you already said that's where we found where it intersects, right? So it's going to be the same value. And you're going to do quantity times the average total cost value at that quantity, which is going to be the same as P sub Z. So you're going to, essentially, these are going to cancel out, right? Your box here has gone to 0. So where those intersect, where your demand curve intersects the average total cost curve, this firm is going to be making 0 economic profits. Now you notice that that quantity is much higher than the monopolistic quantity. All right, so that's all the parts to our graph, and you just got to make sure you label everything correctly. You don't need to do this profit box over here. I was just illustrating that. So you should have these points labeled and this box in here shaded. It's not a box, I guess it's a pseudo triangle, let's call it that. And that's your monopolistic graph for this question. And you should have all the points there. So let me clear. All right, so I think that's all we have to draw for this question. So let's go. All right, so we did all that. All right, so let's go to part B. Now, assume that Phillips' fixed costs increase because of a new lease on its property and Phillips stays in business. Will each of the following increase, decrease, or remain unchanged at Phillips' profit maximizing quantity? And they also want you to explain a little bit, right? So I guess maybe I should have left the graph up, but the key thing here, part B, is to realize that here. Let's draw the thing real quick here, just to illustrate. All right, so we've got demand, marginal revenue, demand. We've got an average total cost. We've got marginal cost. So where MR equals MC, that's where it's going to produce. That was Q sub F. They were going to come up here. And that was P sub F, right? So it's again, just to review how you would quickly sort of draw this basic graph. Now this question is asking, part B now is asking about the fixed cost increase, right? New lease on its property is more expensive. And then they're asking what's going to happen to the deadweight loss. So if you remember, our deadweight loss was this sort of pseudo triangle in here, right, between these 3 points. Now, what happens when the fixed cost goes up, right? So new lease on the property for the gas station increases. What's going to happen to our curves? Well, the only curve that's going to be affected is the average total cost curve. Now remember, average total cost is equal to average fixed costs plus average variable costs, right? And then you get your total costs. So the average variable cost here is not changing, right? Because it's a fixed cost, right? So the average fixed cost is changing. So the average total cost curve will shift. Let's just say it does something like this, right? Let's call that average total cost 2. So this whole curve is sort of shifting up, right? I probably drew it too far there because now we're going to end up in a situation where they may not be making economic profits. But it suffices to say it's not going to change in any way, shape, or form the marginal cost curve, right? Because marginal cost is the cost of one additional unit, and that's not impacted in any way, shape, or form by your fixed cost. So that's the key thing to realize here. So to answer part 1, the deadweight loss is not going to change, right? So this curve down, or not this curve, this triangle-ish thing down here has not changed at all, right? MR is still equal to MC, and that's our quantity. So the quantity hasn't changed. And the price hasn't changed, right? Because we're still at that quantity, we go up to the demand curve. So this has not changed in any way, shape, or form. So the answer to part I there, or part 1, is that the deadweight loss has experienced no change. And I think an explanation, a short, 1 or maybe 2 sentence explanation would be saying that the first of all, you got to state that it's unchanged, and then state that the fixed costs do not change the marginal cost curve, right? So nor the profit maximizing quantity, that's still the same. And if you wanted to redraw this graph and show it, I think that might be a good way to do it, but you don't have to in this case because it just asks you to explain. The average total cost curve would shift up, so that's what I've drawn here in the graph. But as we already mentioned, that has no bearing on the marginal cost curve, which has not changed. So the deadweight loss does not change, and that's the answer. And you got to have some sort of short explanation there. You don't need a whole essay question, just a short sentence. As long as it's written correctly and clearly, I think is okay. Now, part 2 there, what happens to Phillips' economic profit? So as I drew on this graph, and I already mentioned, right, if you calculated economic profit now, I drew this curve pretty far, a major shift. So we're going to take our revenue, right, as our quantity times our price, and then we need to subtract our quantity times our average total cost at that quantity, right? So in this case, I actually drew an economic loss, right, this little rectangle here. So you don't need to actually show it or draw it. But you see how the average total cost curve shifting up will be sure to decrease Phillips' economic profit here with this shift increase. So as long as, again, you just have to have sort of a little explanation and make sure you say, well, Phillips' economic profit will decrease. Even a down arrow would be fine. And then, because of the upward shift in the average total cost curve. So and if you do this visually, right, if you drew this graph, you can certainly see, oh, wait, that economic profit is definitely going to be getting smaller. And the case that I drew here, it actually went away entirely, right? Now they're experiencing losses. So that is part B, 1 and 2, being able to sort of think through that and explain it. And again, it's knowing some of this stuff over here, these formulas, and what'll actually happen to this graph based upon this shift that they were talking about. All right, so let's go to part C. Assume the demand for gasoline decreases because people bike to work more often. All right, so people aren't driving; they're going to ride their bikes. Save the environment. And let's see, part 1. What must be true for Philip to continue to operate in the short run? So this is one of your sort of rules of firms operating. And they know that the firm is continuing to operate. They give you that. So under what conditions would a firm continue to operate? And then what they're asking for here in this part is to essentially say, as long as the price is greater than the average variable cost, the firm will remain open, right? So even if the price is below the average total cost, as long as it's above the variable cost, a firm is sort of making back a little bit of its average fixed cost, so long as that price is slightly above, at least greater than the average variable cost. Now, once it falls, if that was not true, right? If it fell, let's say price fell below the average variable cost, now all of a sudden, for every additional unit of whatever, in this case it's gasoline, whatever it is I'm selling, I'm losing even more, right, for every additional unit I sell. So at that point, I'm going to shut down. Okay, so, and again, that's the short run. So as long as you say this, really all you need is this. So long as price is greater than average variable cost, we know that this fill-up station will continue to remain open. All right, and then part 2. What happens to Phillips profit maximizing quantity and price in the short run, assuming that the firm continues to operate? Well, we know from up here, right? So right here, demand for gasoline decreases, right? So if we were going to redraw this graph, we know these curves, these demand curves and the marginal revenue curve, right? So let's just quickly kind of sketch this out, are shifting inward, right? Demand is much less at every price, and the same thing for marginal revenue. So these curves here are kind of coming in this way, right, at a much steeper slope. And they ask about what's going to happen to the profit maximizing quantity and price in the short run. So you should be able to see, right, if these curves shift further in. So let's just draw it on top of this one. Let's say MR came over here, right? And demand, it's going to get messy, but so let's try demand 2 and MR2. Now our profit maximizing quantity is over here, right? And if you drew this up here, yeah, it's going to be too messy up there. But you can see for sure how the quantity is going to decrease, right? And you should also be able to see how price is going to be less, because our initial demand curve was way up here, and now our new demand curve is was it this one, I guess. So the answer for part 2, as long as you say in some way, shape, or form that the new quantity and price both will decrease, right? Because of this up here, right? The demand decreasing, so you got to recognize that those curves shift inward. And if it helps to draw another graph, right, sketch it out and try and figure out, play around and see what happens to those variables. You can go ahead and do that. So, I said it's a short question, but it actually takes a while to walk through all those. And they do have, it's tricky, explain this. And you don't need to get caught up in a whole, essay explanation, right? Usually one sentence is enough. In this case over here, right, it's just sort of a short little equation, and say, as long as P is greater than ABC, then you're good. So that's what they're looking for, certain specific things, and then you're going to get the points, right, based upon that. All right, so let me